I'm Sister Mary Ann Hinsdale, an associate professor in the theology department here at Boston College. And I'm delighted to share some thoughts and maybe help answer some questions that you might have about Pope Francis's new encyclical, Laudato Si. So maybe a question to begin with is, who is Pope Francis? That may seem obvious. Of course, he's the author of this encyclical I'm going to talk about. But Pope Francis was elected Pope in 2013 in March, and he succeeded Pope Benedict XVI, who resigned, not unprecedentedly, but there hadn't been a pope who resigned in over 600 years. So it was something of a surprise to many people, both the resignation of the pope and the election of Pope Francis. The fact that he took the name Francis was also unusual, and perhaps was a kind of harbinger of this encyclical, because Francis, of course, is a saint that is very associated with ecology and with the environment. An encyclical is the ordinary teaching office of popes, and it is kind of like a letter. Most encyclicals have been addressed to simply the Catholic Church, but there have been a few that have been addressed to the worldwide human community. Pope Francis is doing that in Laudato Si, but Pope John the 23rd was perhaps the first pope to do that back in the 1960s when he issued an encyclical called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. Encyclicals often, in the most recent days, ever since the 19th century encyclical of Leo XIII in 1891, have dealt with social issues. And in fact, they are the main way that popes communicate what is called Catholic social teaching. Some theologians and others have said that the Catholic social teaching of the Catholic Church is its best kept secret. And so this encyclical, Laudato Si, concerns the social teaching that Francis is bringing to our awareness about the ecological devastation that we are witnessing in our present time. So why now this encyclical? Our common home, which is the subtitle of the encyclical, On Care for Our Common Home, is in a state of terrible devastation, ecologically speaking. Another reason is that this coming December, the United Nations is sponsoring a conference in Paris, which it hopes to fashion a universal agreement on the part of all the nations of the world to halt anything that would disrupt and endanger our climate. So this important meeting is a key time for what Francis is trying to do in this encyclical, which is really to offer us a kind of global examination of conscience. So what's this encyclical all about? Well, it's structured according to a method that was developed by a Belgian cardinal named Cardinal Cardijn and enshrined an encyclical that was written by Pope John the 23rd in the early 1960s called Mater et Magistra, in which the church was called Mother and Teacher. And that method that Cardinal Cardijn developed has been used by a number of Catholic organizations who are about transformation of the social world. The method is called See, Judge, Act. And the encyclical, in its 6 chapters, is organized according to that same methodology of See, Judge, Act. And so the first chapter is simply an idea of seeing what's going on. It's entitled, What is Happening to Our Common Home? And in that chapter, he talks about pollution, climate change, the issue of water, which the Pope says is actually a human right, and the problems we're having with water access today, biodiversity being lost, global inequality, and the fact that he acknowledges there are a variety of opinions about these issues as issues that are problems. The second chapter is also involved in this notion of seeing what is taking place, a kind of looking at the signs of our times before we make any judgments or formulate any policies or actions. The second chapter takes a look at the Christian faith and the texts of faith, and it is called The Gospel of Creation. And in that chapter, he kind of gives us a review of the biblical sources for justifying our concern about the environment, particularly the notion that we are all connected. All creation is connected, not just the human, but the animal, the plants, even the non-sentient part of reality is connected. Then the encyclical moves to the question or the state of judging. And this judging takes place in the next two chapters, Chapter 3 on the human roots of the ecological crisis, and in Chapter 4, which I think is a new word or a new phrase for most Catholics and Christians and actually people in general, and that is integral ecology. And what the Pope means by integral ecology is that there is an ecology about our daily life, and that there is an ecology that involves economics and our organization of society. Two key ethical principles are used as the norms for judgment in this fourth chapter, and that is the principle of human dignity and the principle of the common good. Then we move in the two final chapters to the question of action. And here he talks about lines of approach and action in Chapter 5. And in Chapter 6, he talks about ecological education, that we have to be educated ecologically, and also spirituality. In the chapter on approach and action, I think that students of economics and also business students will find this particularly provocative because he talks about the need to plan. And of course, anybody in business knows that you often need a business plan if you're going to succeed in your endeavor. But the way the Pope goes about talking about that sort of plan is to remember what he brought up in Chapter 2 about the interconnectedness of all creation and of all reality and our interdependence with one another, that those who are affected by this plan, any plan, have to also be taken into consideration and not just thought about, but actually involved in the planning, especially in terms of how it's going to affect the poor. And that is a kind of common refrain that we see throughout this encyclical. It's not simply about what's going to happen to human beings in general, but in particular, how is any action that we take or any thinking that we do going to affect the poor. I mentioned the phrase integral ecology. Some other phrases that might be new to our ears are phrases that Francis uses several times in the encyclical, like we live in a throwaway culture, or the emphasis that he puts on consumerism, not only as something that is not good, but in fact is a sin. This gets into, I think, the areas where we will find both things that challenge the reader and also things that will inspire. Certainly when he mentions quite specifically air conditioning as something that needs to be thought about, whether we really need it. As I sit here on a hot Boston summer afternoon, that's pretty challenging to think that somehow we should do away with air conditioning. And yet it's a very practical consideration to make with regard to how we are damaging the environment. Another phrase that he uses is the technocratic paradigm. And what he means by this is that we have a belief, or we've come to accept as a kind of act of faith, that technology can solve everything. Whereas he's quite critical of some things having to do with technology, especially when he speaks about the digital world and how that has removed us from personal relationships and can create a mindset that thinks of ourselves totally as individuals and not relational, not in touch with other people, and that this is at the heart of the problem of our lack of understanding of how we are interdependent with all of creation. Francis has a lot of hard things to say, particularly for the northern Atlantic countries like the United States. However, he also has some things that I found very, very inspiring. I mentioned earlier that the idea of this encyclical was perhaps not to lay down any plans or policies that must be followed, no dogmas or doctrines, but to give us the opportunity to have a global examination of conscience. And in the last chapter of the encyclical, that is what I really found there. And I would just like to end by reading a short paragraph. Francis writes, Christian spirituality proposes an alternative understanding of the quality of life and encourages a prophetic and contemplative lifestyle, one capable of deep enjoyment, free of the obsession with consumption. And then he goes on further and says, when lived freely and consciously, the sobriety I am recommending is liberating. It is not a lesser life or one lived with less intensity. On the contrary, it is a way of living life to the full. In reality, those who enjoy more and live better each moment are those who have given up dipping here and there, always on the lookout for what they do not have. They experience what it means to appreciate each person and each thing, learning familiarity with the simplest things and how to enjoy them. So they are able to shed unsatisfied needs, reducing their obsessiveness and weariness. Even living on little, they can live a lot, above all when they cultivate other pleasures and find satisfaction in human encounters, service, in developing their gifts, in music and art, in contact with nature, in prayer. Happiness means knowing how to limit some needs, which only diminish us, and being open to the many different possibilities that life can offer.